Thought and ethics. We're going to have some thought-provoking presentations. One of them will be in Spanish, the other two in English, but all questions can be presented in English. Así vamos a comenzar. Tenemos tres presentaciones muy interesantes. Uno va a ser en español y los otros dos en inglés, pero se puede hacer las preguntas en inglés. We're going to begin with Enrique Tellas, professor of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. He'll be presenting on El Contagio Global, la naturaleza como límite y competencia. After, we'll be hearing from Professor Eric Padilla, an independent scholar from Louisiana State University. And the title of his presentation is From Water as First Principle to Liberating Praxis, the Search for an Environmental Ethics in the Caribbean Region. And then we have a presentation from Professor Elizabeth Paquette, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and her title is Beyond Man, Environment, a Ceremony of Liberation. And so first we'll hear from the panelists and then open the floor for questions. I'll also be looking at the chat function to read off questions. So let's begin with Enrique Tellas.
Muchas gracias, Fred. Tenemos 20 minutos, ¿verdad? Aproximadamente.
Yes, and we've all agreed that we'll be grabando, we'll be recording, and each speaker will have no more than 20 minutes because we do want to leave time for questions. Go right ahead.
Ok, muchas gracias. Gracias a todos los que han hecho posible este encuentro, el segundo encuentro. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí con amigos y colegas ya. Voy a tocar un tema que trata de recabar, de recuperar algunas de las discusiones que se hicieron ayer e inclusive hace unos minutos en la otra conferencia, antes que esta, porque me gusta darle unidad a lo que digo con respecto a los otros compañeros. Entonces voy a tocar el tema, quizá me voy a desviar tantito del tema original, pero voy a estar en la misma línea, solo que voy a dar una vuelta muy, muy grande para llegar justo al punto que necesito. El primer tema que quisiera tocar, son aproximadamente 3 o 4, depende un poco del tiempo, es la cuestión de la inmunidad. La inmunidad tiene ahora una relevancia muy fuerte por toda la cuestión de la pandemia. Desde luego es muy polémico. Si ustedes recuerdan, en febrero, marzo, empezó a haber muchísimos textos que circularon en Internet, sobre todo, que hablaban de la pandemia, intelectuales europeos sobre todo, algunos norteamericanos y desde luego Latinoamérica. Entonces se volvió una pandemia dentro de otra pandemia, ¿no? Porque muchos de ellos tenían además algún tipo de sesgo teórico un poco extraño, ¿no? Cuestionando, vamos, ¿no? Como teorías conspiracionistas y cosas por el estilo. Entonces quiero empezar con algo que me ha parecido un poco polémico, que es justamente, y lo estamos trabajando mucho en México, junto con el profesor Dussel, estamos retomando algunos autores que vienen de la tradición de Foucault, como Agamben, Espósito y algunos otros. Entonces voy a empezar con Espósito intencionalmente porque este autor italiano, este filósofo de la política italiano, está trabajando el tema de la inmunidad, ¿sí? Entonces voy a presentar ahora voy a poner un pizarrón, una pizarra, un Blackboard. Comparto pantalla para poder hacerlo de manera un poco más fluida. Y esto me ayuda en parte porque creo que me puede ayudar bastante a ver una cuestión muy estructural, muy estructural, porque ayer estaba notando que buena parte de las charlas tenían un problema con conceptos y como son conceptos muy elásticos, ese es el problema. Cuando tenemos conceptos muy elásticos, podemos poner el contenido que queramos, pero tiene el problema de que son tan elásticos que a veces son contraproducentes, a veces son conceptos antagónicos. Entonces, quiero ser relativamente claro con esto y voy a empezar con una crítica a Espósito, ¿sí? A este autor italiano que les decía, y sobre todo con el concepto de inmunidad. Ahora había estado escribiendo en inglés y se me confunde un poco con el español, pero quisiera que tomaran en cuenta lo siguiente. Hay dos paradigmas de inmunidad, dos paradigmas. Es la propuesta, de hecho, de este mismo autor. Estos dos paradigmas son relevantes, ya verán por qué. El primer paradigma es por lo siguiente. Él está pensando en una cierta totalidad, ¿sí? Esta totalidad es muy interesante porque todo lo que hay afuera de esta totalidad, estoy pensando un poco en términos como los maneja Hegel y que los retoma Dussel finalmente en la filosofía de la liberación, tenemos en todo caso acá afuera, hay un adentro y un afuera muy claramente definido y el afuera es un afuera que es algo extraño, perdón. Y el concepto de inmunidad en este caso es algo que tiene que ver con la barrera que uno construye, digamos, cuando uno piensa en términos de una posible interacción, de una posible conexión, ¿sí? En este sentido, esta barrera es muy similar, o sea, esto es algo abstracto, pero si lo queremos llevar a algo concreto para tener un ejemplo y una referencia histórica, bien podemos pensar que es como Estados Unidos cuando pone el muro entre México y este país. Cuando hay algo extraño, simplemente no se deja entrar, ¿sí? Entonces se rechaza inmediatamente, no entra. De manera que acá adentro se afirma todo lo que es, todo lo que es la misma totalidad se afirma en sí misma y se autopercibe como perfecto. Esta autopercepción de perfectibilidad es un problema, porque entonces no acepta lo que pueda haber afuera, ni como producto suyo, ni como algo que puede enriquecer esto. Ahora, ¿dónde está la cuestión de la inmunidad aquí? De que finalmente se afirma el sistema inmunológico tal cual, con este símil que se hace entre las ciencias biológicas o médicas y la filosofía, el sistema se hace simplemente más fuerte, ¿no? Hay más fortaleza, digamos, ¿no? Se hace más fuerte. Bueno, es más fuerte el sistema y se hace más inmune. Su sistema inmunológico de alguna manera queda intacto y es esencialmente el mismo, no cambia, ¿sí? Ahora, en cambio, un segundo paradigma de la inmunidad del mismo Espósito nos plantea que hay una totalidad, ¿sí? Otra vez tenemos algo afuera y adentro claramente definido en una frontera, ¿sí? Pero la frontera es porosa, ¿sí? Aquí la frontera es relativamente porosa. Lo voy a poner otra vez aquí. Hay una frontera que es relativamente porosa. Y pensemos en términos ahora de, antes de hablar del problema político, quisiera llevarlo a un problema más tener un ejemplo un poco más concreto para hacerlo más fácil. Pensemos en el veneno de una serpiente. El veneno lo extraemos de la serpiente, lo combinamos químicamente con otras sustancias, lo hacemos vacuna y esta vacuna la inoculamos a nuestro cuerpo, la incorporamos, ¿sí? De manera que cuando la serpiente me pica, yo sé que puedo tener un sistema inmunológico más fuerte, ¿sí? De tal manera que ya no me hace daño. Entonces, en el símil de pensando en un enemigo político ya, lo que hacemos es que este enemigo puede tener aspectos positivos y negativos. No nos interesan los positivos porque es enemigo desde el punto de vista de la totalidad. Nos interesa, ciertamente, el aspecto negativo. Este aspecto negativo es el que entra, ¿sí? insisto, la frontera aquí en este segundo paradigma es porosa. Entonces entra y lo que hacemos es que pensamos en términos de que ese aspecto negativo puede ayudar a que esta totalidad de alguna manera se haga más grande y más fuerte, de manera que hay una totalidad 2, digamos, que es más fuerte, ¿sí? Más fuerte y más grande, ¿de acuerdo? Entonces, en ese sentido, el sistema inmunológico ayuda a que esencialmente, y de la misma manera que el primer paradigma, se haga más grande y más fuerte, pero que esencialmente quede exactamente igual. Esto, desde luego, ya podemos entrar aquí al tema propiamente ecológico. Esto en Espósito le llama a esto el fármacon, es un término griego. Quizá no vale la pena comentar que el fármacon es una droga, ¿sí? En español suena a fármaco, sí, es muy similar, pero creo que de alguna manera en inglés creo que no sería lo mismo, ¿no? Pero en español decimos farmacia. Farmacia viene de fármacon, justamente, ¿no? La drugstore, ¿no? En inglés. Bien, esto es interesante porque de alguna manera el enemigo puede ser subsumido, puede estar adentro, pero solamente ciertos aspectos que ayudan a la totalidad a afirmarse. Entonces, esto es todo un tema, ¿no? Desde luego aquí podemos pasar abruptamente a hacer el contraste con algo que muchos de ustedes ya conocen, pero vale la pena que lo comentemos rápidamente porque la parte ecológica está ahí metido. Voy a poner un tercer paradigma, ¿sí? Que es el de Dussel, y en este sentido, pensemos que la filosofía de la liberación se basa totalmente en esto. Tenemos una totalidad, ¿sí? La totalidad no es perfecta, no se autopercibe o no es considerada como perfecta, de manera que tiene efectos negativos. Estos efectos negativos, lo voy a poner con signos matemáticos para que se entienda la intención de esto. Estos efectos negativos, y por eso hablamos de negatividad, es un término propio de Hegel, de Kant, ¿no? Esta negatividad es lo que conocemos como víctima, ¿sí? Este es el punto fuerte porque a esto le llamamos exterioridad como categoría, y esta víctima, cuando de alguna manera interpela la totalidad, lo que está haciendo es una decolonialidad, ¿sí? Toco el tema porque ayer se discutió un poco y creo que no estaba bien conectado. La liberación viene solo hasta después, cuando a partir de la totalidad y a partir de la crítica de la exterioridad, tenemos otra totalidad, ¿sí? Que no es la misma que la anterior. Desde luego, hay pequeños procesos transformadores en los sistemas políticos y tenemos procesos más profundos que pueden convertirse en revoluciones y ser sumamente radicales, ¿no? Bien, y hasta aquí voy a dejar esta cuestión. Obviamente hay un contraste muy fuerte porque casi todos los paradigmas que tenemos en la filosofía política, que tocan inclusive los temas de la ecología, son como estos dos primeros, ¿sí? Casi ninguno es como el tercero, que es la propuesta, digamos, crítica de Dussel y de toda la escuela de la filosofía de la liberación. Y precisamente por eso creo que debemos de conocer muy bien lo que se está haciendo en estos lugares para hacer una crítica exhaustiva de estos temas. Ahora, con esto quiero ir directamente a la cuestión de la ecología, porque la misma modernidad ha definido varias cosas. Si alguien me pregunta ahora, ¿y dónde está aquí la naturaleza o algo que tenga que ver con la ecología? Bueno, es un problema, es todo un tema, porque en realidad la modernidad, ¿sí? En términos muy amplios, la modernidad ha definido al sujeto, ¿sí? En una cierta interacción con el objeto, donde claramente el sujeto es la humanidad, el hombre, de manera eufemística se dice hombre, ¿sí? Y el objeto es la naturaleza, cuando en realidad, bueno, esto ya plantea muchos problemas, ¿no? En primera, bueno, antes que esto, aquí es cuando se ha planteado la cuestión del metabolismo. Y con este metabolismo usado mucho en el siglo XIX, Marx lo usó, ¿no? Por cierto, tenemos un problema porque seguimos considerando la naturaleza como un objeto pasivo, como un objeto inerte, como un objeto que es intervenido por el humano, y a eso le llamamos de hecho trabajo, ¿sí? Esa es la definición de trabajo en rasgos muy grandes. Pero tenemos un problema. Pareciera, y si ustedes lo recuerdan, al principio de la pandemia se hablaba de que el causante de todo este problema había sido el murciélago. Y después nos fuimos con los pangolines, ¿no? Y después nos fuimos con otros animales. Desde luego, no solamente ellos, sino es la interacción del ser humano con estos animalitos. Y siempre queremos ver en la naturaleza algo negativo. No es que yo quiera reivindicar al virus como algo positivo, pero tenemos que entender que hay una coexistencia con la naturaleza y los humanos hemos ganado tanto espacio que le hemos quitado espacio a toda la dinámica biológica que hay en la naturaleza. Entonces, eso es de por sí ya un problema. Entonces, lo que yo he estado trabajando últimamente es la cuestión de considerar no el metabolismo, o en todo el caso el metabolismo es una parte de algo más grande, que es, bueno, el problema, de hecho, antes de esto, el problema que, que planteábamos con los animales exclusivamente es la zoonosis. Este término se hizo muy popular hace 2 o 3 meses que se empezó a hablar mucho de esto. Sin embargo, la zoonosis es una parte del metabolismo, considerando a la misma naturaleza como un objeto inerte. La cuestión fuerte, creo yo, es considerar al sujeto, ¿sí? O en todo caso a la humanidad, junto junto con un conjunto más grande, ¿sí? A esto, a este conjunto más grande de seres vivos y no vivos, le voy a llamar simbiosis, ¿sí? Y entonces la simbiosis me ayuda mucho a entender que la naturaleza no solo no es un objeto muerto, sino, o pasivo o inerte, ¿sí? Sino que también es un objeto que tiene mucho que ver con la misma vida, aunque tenga elementos inertes. Por ejemplo, yo respiro y cuando respiro hay oxígeno, nitrógeno y oxígeno sobre todo, pero el oxígeno me ayuda porque cuando entra a mi cuerpo inicia un proceso químico que ayuda a la generación de proteínas y otras cosas. Ciertamente, el oxígeno es inerte, sí, pero eso permite la vida. Los virus, todos los gérmenes que están tratando de entrar a nuestro cuerpo constantemente, que se cuenta por miles de millones, billions en inglés, en castellano serían miles de millones, continuamente, toda la vida estamos expuestos a ello, de alguna manera fortalece nuestro sistema inmunológico, ¿sí? Entonces no son de por sí malos. Siempre hay esta tendencia a considerar que hay algo malo en la naturaleza, como en los dos primeros paradigmas. Déjenme aclarar que estos paradigmas, además, tienen un sustento clásico de la filosofía clásica, porque esto es lo más cercano, por ejemplo, a Hobbes, ¿sí? Y podríamos encontrar otras similitudes, otras relaciones que hay con otros pensadores. Y algo así como esto, pues no solo no lo he encontrado, sino que ha sido complicado tratar de, de conectarlo con la filosofía, ¿no? Estoy viendo que se me está acabando un poco el tiempo. Lo único que quisiera comentar al respecto es, para tratar de concluir, es una cuestión que no estaba aclarado ayer, ¿sí? Pero que es muy complicada a veces entenderlo. Este esquema es totalmente de Dussel, ¿sí? Yo nada más lo voy a reproducir aquí y comentar un par de cosas, pero podemos pensar el cosmos como una parte que no conozco y que de alguna manera es intencional este círculo incompleto porque es algo mucho más grande que nos rebasa. Y aquí está la naturaleza, es una parte, la naturaleza es una parte del cosmos, pero con lo que nosotros interactuamos como cultura es la materia, ¿sí? Como cultura. Y acá desde luego nuestro mundo tiene una relación con la naturaleza análogamente a la cultura con la materia. ¿De acuerdo? Ahora, la cuestión es de que justamente si entendemos este esquema, entendemos, creo, bastante bien la cuestión de la simbiosis que estamos hablando. Vean que este esquema es sumamente contrastante con los otros esquemas, perdón, con este sobre todo, con el que tienen que ver con esta cuestión de sujeto-objeto que nos ha definido en la modernidad, ¿no? Estamos en contra, o de alguna manera estamos tratando de armar una contranarrativa en términos de esto, y pues hay muchas consecuencias que tienen que ver con esta cuestión como para poderlas discutir ahora. Lo ecológico, por tanto, va mucho más allá de lo que generalmente hemos contemplado, que es una parte exclusivamente material, la reproducción de la vida, etcétera. Tiene que ver también con una parte formal, pensando en términos de las generaciones futuras, ¿no? Y más cosas, pero también tiene que ver con una parte muy importante que es la factibilidad. En inglés, feasibility es un término difícil porque tiene que ver con la cuestión de las posibilidades o imposibilidades. Desde luego esto es una plática un poco politizada, pero bueno, espero que podamos interactuar en unos minutos, ¿sí? Ok, hasta aquí lo dejo, hasta aquí paro para dejar paso a mis compañeros que quiero
Okay,
escuchar.
I want to thank Professor Enrique Tejas for thought-provoking presentation. We've seen several paradigms for immunity. We've seen a contrast with Enrique Dussels' notion of totality and exteriority. And then finally, this big picture of what's the relation between the cosmos, mundo, and ecosistema. So there's going to be room for questions, I'm sure. This has stimulated a lot of thought. So now we're going to go to our second speaker, Enrique Tejas, and his title again is, Eric Padilla, and his title again is From Water as First Principle to Liberating Praxis, the Search for an Environmental Ethics in the Caribbean Region. Welcome.
Thank you, Fred, and welcome to every participant. I will be reading my article. First, I will read a summary, and then I will read the actual article. So, from water as first principle to practice of liberation, the search for an environmental ethics in the Caribbean region. For the Greek philosopher of Phoenician origin, Thales of Miletus, water was the archetype, that is, the origin, the beginning, the first cause of all existing things, creating in turn, perhaps, the first Western theory about the physical world. But while for some scholars of ancient Western philosophy, Miletus' theories of water implies understanding the world as a collection of materials, the liberating practice proposed by Enrique Dussels' ethics not only recognizes in water the ability to quench the thirst of the thirsty, but it also recognizes that the responsible management of water is a practical means of affirming life. In this paper, I will first evaluate the philosophical interpretation of Thales' thesis of water and suggest that Thales Miletus took inspiration from the cultures and myths in which he was raised to elaborate his thesis on water. Second, I will approach the drought in the Caribbean region to explain how the centrality of water can mark the development of a philosophy of liberation that starts with those who suffer from water scarcity. I will critique Jeremy Rifkin's notion of a third industrial revolution by examining how the global capitalist exploitation of natural resources literally changes the way the environment is treated and perpetuates the imperious consumerism so present in the capitalism in vogue. Once we recognize that a renewable energy system that uses the tools of capitalism only perpetuates a selfish outlook that does not recognize the voice and feeling of the poor, we will see that Miletus' thesis and the liberating praxis proposed by Enrique Dussels are not so far off after all. If it is true that for the former, nature is inspiration, while for the latter, the oppressed are a priority, both provide us with an ecological twist that could give us light to address the scarcity of fresh water experienced in the Caribbean. According to scholars of the history of Greek philosophy, this way of thought originated from an attempt to reason out the organization and formation of the universe by means of a path of thought that sought to become autonomous from mythology. Thus, for example, instead of thinking that the gods were in charge of manipulating nature, for its organization and formation, they began to think about a natural order that started precisely from and in nature. This does not mean that the ideas of the first Greek philosophers did not form a bridge between mythological and rational reality. On the contrary, continuing the perennial and universal religious, aesthetics, and scientific need of all times, the first Greek philosophers were also in charge of finding a relationship amid the apparent multi-universal chaos. The search for unity, as the classical Scottish philosopher Gutierrez states, and quote, "We have seen it in the religious poetry of a prehistorical era, and we will find it again in its most extreme formulation, 100 years after Miletus, approximately in Parmenides." End of quote. The influence of mythology, therefore, on the thought of the early philosophers of the 1,000 years, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, was absolute, although not so much as to prevent the development of more autonomous rational thought. Just as mythology influenced the emergence of philosophy, in this case the Greek one, mythology also took elements from nature and the natural order to explain its beliefs. Hence, for Homer, who is credited with the authoring the Iliad and the Odyssey, the rivers were kautrophoi, the ones in charge of feeding and making the young grow through what is liquid. The rivers, therefore, were offered with young people's hair so that they, from their puberty, could receive the seed of growth and sexual vigor. Rites such as these were based on the fact that water was necessary for the emergence and sustenance of life. As the Spanish philosopher José Solana Dueso states, quote, "It is not strange, therefore, that the water of springs, lakes, or rivers should be venerated and deified in multiple forms. The river gods, such as the Nile, the Alpheus, or the Eridian, sons of the gods Ocean, and Tethys, according to Hesiod, or the Naiads, the countless nymphs of springs, rivers, and lakes, are proof of this belief. Therefore, water took a divine and creative sense from its fundamental character in Mesopotamian and Egyptian cosmogonies, which is relevant for our writing since it could be asserted that the first Greek philosopher of Phoenician origin, Thales of Miletus, knew the mythological sense and cultural centrality that water had in the midst of the society where he grew up. Although we do not have writings by Thales of Miletus, his thesis on water is well known thanks to the Metaphysics text by Aristotle. There, Aristotle writes, and quote, "Most of the early philosophers considered that the principle of all things were only those that have a material aspect. As to the number and form of such a principle, not all say the same thing, but Thales, the initiator of this type of philosophy, claims that it is water, so he also declared that the earth is above water. Perhaps he conceived this supposition because he saw that the food of all things is humid, and because what is humid is born from its own heat and lies by it. For that from which it is born is the beginning of all things." End of quote. A possible conjectural explanation of the thesis demonstrates the primacy of water in Thales' theory by means of mythology and reason. That is, first, in question of the mythological explanation, it can be assumed that Miletus was influenced by the Babylonian cosmogony of the Enuma Elish, through which water, composed of the deities Apsu, Tiamat, and Mumu, with the banks of clouds and fog, invaded the entire most primitive phase of the formation of the universe. This cosmology, which can be associated to the Homeric description of Ocean and Tethys as the parents of all springs, rivers, fountains, and the sea, presented mythological basis to sustain that water is the origin of the whole universe, and therefore the earth is floating above water, its foundation. Second, in question to the rational explanation, one can state that Miletus related the humility of the seed, semen, human heat with the idea of life. In this way, the Ionian thinker could have been influenced by an ancient stage in which nature was endowed with life. Hence, it can be stated that both the mythological and rational explanation of Thales of Miletus were inspired by the observation of nature and its properties. This provides us with a framework for thinking about the reality of water from the perspective of water scarcity. If Thales valued water after growing up in the middle of two-river culture, what value could water have for those who suffer from its scarcity and the effects of its pollution? The reality is that of people who experience a shortage of drinking water or known it is contaminated, why water is life. There is no need to elaborate a whole thesis that is too sophisticated to explain its centrality for the survival of the community. For the poor, those who know they are in need, those who know they have nothing to lose because they have already lost everything, the ravages of burning fossil fuels and the constant environmental pollution are present as a reality that is understood from the flesh. The words of economist and sociologist Jeremy Rifkin stating that, quote, the most important impact of global rise in temperature is on the water cycle is known by them precisely because they experience not only the ravages of sudden and short-lived heavy rainfall, floods, and droughts, but because the poor people have lived them in the midst of a survival mentality, in the midst of forced minimalism. To the climate change and drought problems, let's add, as the Center for Investigative Journalism reports in its series, The Caribbean Dries Up, in the last 7 years, the lack of legal regulations and the illegal and private market has exploited community water supplies, leaving, end quote, more than 5 million people without partial or total access to this vital liquid, at least in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. End of quote. The lack of a political framework to listen to the voices of each of these people has certainly been conspicuous by its absence. Faced with an scenario like this, a theoretical knowledge of the reality experienced by those who suffer from water shortages is only a first step. We could elaborate a whole system that explains in detail how we should abandon the era of burning fossil fuel to a system that uses renewable energy, as presented by Jeremy Rifkin in his book, Third Industrial Revolution. The system who would think of would not, the system we would think of would not only use hydrogen and other energy storage techniques, but would share and sell the surplus of its neighbors. Without a doubt, it would be a world not only more eco-friendly, but more community-based in a global village system. The problem is that a system such as the Third Industrial Revolution will not be effective if it does not educate itself in maintaining responsible use of the natural resources available to us. Otherwise, the Third Industrial Revolution project would be an utopia, or worse, a device that would perpetuate the idea of excessive consumption justified by the use of clean energy. The fact is that the Third Industrial Revolution faces the imminent need for consumerism present in the capitalist system that feeds an individualistic view of self-worth. As Juan Camilo Cajigas Rotundo states in his essay, The Biocoloniality of Power, hegemonic globalization, a product of colonization, has chosen to monopolize not only the excessive desire of human beings to possess goods, wealth, and property, but also appropriated the very idea of the environment. In this way, the notion of sustainable development has objectified nature and turned it into a means that allows human beings, especially corporate elites and transnational corporations, to maintain an excessive consumption line, but now justified as being cleaner and eco-friendlier. Hence, we should be concerned about a third industrial revolution that seems to be eco-friendly but does not question excessive consumption. So how can we address the lack of responsible relationship with nature without using the capitalist tools of excessive consumption? Faced with such a panorama, we should not begin a theory without returning to the basis, to nature, to the foundation. Miletus himself used the cultures in which he was raised as an inspiration to develop his philosophical or at least rational thesis on water. For Miletus, water was life because it became the principle of foundation of all other natural things. That is, the life represented in water was what one could say it sustained the earth and all the life that resides in it. It is here that Miletus' thesis can resonate in an ethic of liberation that recognizes in the thirst of the thirsty, the death and the injustice. The ideal of a philosophy of liberation, as Enrique Dussel himself states in his Ethics of Liberation, should place life first, life, the happy human life. This type of philosophy cannot rest in the knowledge that not only is there a shortage of fresh water for the Caribbean region, for example, but it also knows that millions of people have been left partially or totally without access to drinking water. Without doubt, water scarcity is not only synonymous with death, but also with corruption and injustice. Using Miletus and the philosophy of liberation as allies to recognize the value of water in philosophy should not seem like a crazy idea after all. The problem is that although Miletus' thesis can be associated with an anticipation of scientific thought or simply a rationalization of the myths that inspired it, certainly what has made Thales stand out as the first Greek philosopher is, among other things, having sought unity in the universe through a material element found in nature. To do this, he had to make use of hypotheses to support, to support his argument. In this way, Miletus' hypothesis did not have to use water, but could have, so the screen is moving. In this way, Thales' hypothesis did not have to use water, but could have been based on any natural material on which to demonstrate the unity of the universe. In the words of Guthrie, and quote, "It is not the choice of water as the arche that deserves our attention to Thales. It is hypothesis. It is the hypothesis, the question he raised, that in the opinion of scientists constitutes their right to immortality." End of quote. However, knowing that Thales' mythical forerunners, as well as the life provided by water, were key to the origins of his philosophy, and that the myths were influenced by an interpretation of the natural world and its properties, I wish to argue that Thales not only looked at water, but chose it, knowing that it was necessary for life. In other words, I argue that although it is irrefutable to recognize that Thales' hypothesis constitutes an advance in rationalizing the organization and constitution of the universe, it would be unacceptable to hide the historical and personal background of water in the imaginary of the culture in which Thales was raised and from which he took inspiration. As it is well known, not by mere theory, but by community experience, water is certainly not only a molecule that allows or is fundamental for life, but it currently speaks to us through the lived experience of each one of those who faced not only poor water quality, but also its scarcity in the Caribbean and the world. Certainly, Miletus does not present us with a solution to the water shortage that is becoming more and more evident in the Caribbean region. However, knowing that his thesis on water takes inspiration from the life that water provides, teaches us that philosophy must always play in favor of those who suffer and those who are most at risk of losing their lives, their voice, their ability to name due to social injustices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. the way you weave together the underlying theme of the ethical imperative to defend life, especially the giving of life of water, linking it to early Greek thinking, not making rigid distinctions between what inspires mythology and rational thought. All of this, I think, in the question period is very evocative. Really appreciate it. Okay, now we move to our third speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Paquette, Assistant Professor at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. The presentation with the title Beyond Man, Environment, a Ceremony of Liberation. Welcome. Elizabeth? Let's give Professor Paquette just a moment here. There could be some technical issue. While we wait, I want to make sure to recognize Iris Soto Ruiz, who's really making the technical aspect of this and many other sessions happen flawlessly. So we really appreciate you, Iris. It's possible that our last speaker is trying to reconnect, but in the meantime, I'd like to mention one of the comments by Gustavo. Esa simbiosis, and here I think he's referring to the first presentation, Professor Tellez, esa simbiosis nunca desapareció en nuestras culturas originarias que dialogan con los demás seres con los que coexistimos en los ecosistemas vivos. Lejos está el discurso ecologista que cree salvar a la naturaleza, cuando una de las mayores cuestiones que nos debemos es dejarnos salvar por ella. So this is a little bit different perspective. Gustavo suggesting that nature in some sense needs to save us. And now we're back to Professor Paquette. We're regaining connectivity. Greetings.
Yes, my apologies, everyone. I'm gonna try and share my screen quickly. Hopefully it will go fine. While I'm doing this, thank you to the organizers. Thank you also to the, I'm learning a great deal from the presentation so far. And so I thank you. And hopefully everyone can see my screen at this point in time. The title of my presentation is Beyond Man and Environment, Ceremonies of Liberation. I want to start by thinking about where I'm located. I know we're all in different places right now, but I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm on the traditional territories of the Catawba, Waxhaw, Cherokee, and Sugaree peoples. This is also the traditional crossroads of the Cherokee, Catawba, Saponi, and Congolese people prior to colonization. And in reminding myself of this is part of a way of interrogating the histories, present-day patterns of settler colonialism and oppression, and the many indigenous forms of resistance in this place. My argument is broken down in the following way. Basically, I'm starting, and I'm primarily going to talk about Sylvia Wynter's project. So she's a decolonial theorist, originally from Jamaica, and she moved to the United States, and how it is that her project can be read as addressing environmental racism. So this is not something that's at the forefront of her work, but I think is underlying a lot of her writings. Briefly, also, I'll think about her project in relation to prominent scholars in environmental racism, and the ways in which what she calls a new conception of what it means to be human can be helpful in thinking about how to address the current climate crisis. And finally, thinking about future iterations. This is part of a larger project. I'll be thinking about how it is that her project lends itself to thinking about critical indigenous theory. So how her kind of decolonial theory also extends in this way. So much of what I'll be presenting today comes from a book that's coming out in October with Minnesota Press titled Universal Emancipation. That said, this is a slightly new orientation to her work. where I seek to sort of understand this connection to critical Indigenous studies. And so all this is to say that I look forward to any comments that you all will provide today. So here's a quick outline of the presentation. I'll begin with what she calls the genres of being human. Then I'll move into the connections between this genre being human in relation to space and place. And this is where she begins talking about geography and environment. Third, I'm going to connect this to contemporary discussions of environmental racism. And then fourth, I'll look at how it is that this new conception of the human that she offers is a way to address these concerns, although point 3 and 4 will be are more sort of future moves that I'll make, and less so what's going to happen in this presentation specifically. So turning first to the genres of being human, my apologies for those who know Winter already. So to begin, she developed a conception of the Judeo-Christian subject, or the true Christian self. And so the Christian conception of the subject is theocentric and loosely corresponds to conceptions of subject in medieval Latin Christian Europe. Generally speaking, the Christian subject presupposes the notion of the existence of this true Christian self. The true Christian self can be understood as being gifted with spirit and thus blessed by the grace of God. At the same time, not all persons were attributed to the position of this true Christian self. Instead, outside of this order of existence, there is a space of otherness for those who have succumbed to the ills of fallen flesh, those who exist outside the grace of God, and those who are sinful by nature. Specifically, this refers to heretics or enemies of Christ or pagan idolaters. Of course, within the general existence, there is also a plan of salvation to cure the ills of those who were enslaved by original sin, insofar as original sin threatens all subjects of the order. As a result, there is actually degrees of spiritual perfection and imperfection, resulting in a hierarchy of what it means to be human. So this is the first concept she develops in 2 of her main writings, Unsettling the Coloniality of Being and 1492. The second is the rational political subject of the state, or what she calls the Man One. And so the rational political subject of the state roughly corresponds historically to the Renaissance period. The narrative Winter develops in Unsettling the Coloniality of Being draws upon the fluctuating influence of science and religion in knowledge production. Put simply, following the Copernican revolution, we find in the Enlightenment era a concept of man-humanity that presupposes reason via the new role of science as a founding idea for the new universal man. Within this new framework, God becomes knowable to human beings insofar as human beings were conceived as being created in God's image, contra the theocentric conception of the human for whom knowledge of God was foreclosed, and that's the true Christian self that came prior. Regarding the formation of the subject in particular, what it meant to be human in this era became equated with the capacity for rationality, which additionally came to adhere to the degree to which one could obey the laws of the state. As a result, the state itself determined what it meant to be rational. And within this framework, God became more beneficial, and mankind was now considered capable of understanding God's plan. So following this Man One, there's Man Two, which she calls the economic or biological man. So this economic or biological genre of being human continues to pervade in Western social and political contexts, and it began in the 19th century by way of liberal humanist intellectuals. Generally speaking, this conception of the human is dependent upon Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. In particular, there are 2 premises of Darwin's theory that are particularly important to Winter's construction of Man Two. And they are, first, the human exists in line in pure continuity with all other organic forms of life. And second, that natural selection impacts the fitness of species, resulting in certain traits being passed down to future generations through reproduction. Alongside this biocentric conception of the human is the economic conception of the human, which she calls Homo economicus. So this new category of otherness is now comprised in this instance of the homeless, the poor, the systemically made jobless and criminalized, of the undeveloped, as a category for the economically damnés, rather than as before, the politically condemned. Man Two is on the one hand constructed on the basis of what it means to be economically productive member of society, and the ills of society are, as a result, concern the population who are perceived as not contributing economically. So here, an economic hierarchy is mapped onto a biocentric hierarchy, or in other words, economic success and thus economic failure is mapped onto a conception of who is most fit or least fit in society. As a result, the economically damned society or the dependents of society can thus justifiably, according to the system, be deselected from society and found undeserving of social aid. Second, drawing from a Darwinian conception of the continuity between all living creatures, the economic and biocentric conception of man also operates upon the continuity of those who are most fit and those who are least fit. So we have in each of these three instances, we have as a dominant conception of what it means to be human that changes in different periods, but the condition or the constitution of what it means to be human is always found on the basis of its negation, so those who are excluded from this category. So the rational subject of man one is juxtaposed against the irrational and non-rational other. Same thing with the economic and biologically fit of man two is juxtaposed against the unfit of man two as well. So this brings us to the question of how it is that these genres of being human are related to space. In order to understand this, Sylvia Wynter turns to the Valladolid debate between Las Casas and Sepúlveda. So the Valladolid controversy of 1550-51 was one of the first European debates about the rights of colonized peoples. Of course, it should be noted here that the rights of colonized people need to be thought in relation to arguments for the justification or legitimation of the rights of European settlers over the New World and the peoples who inhabited these new worlds. So the two figures that were engaged in this debate were Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. Las Casas was a 16th century Dominican friar and one of the first European settlers in America, while Sepúlveda was a 16th century philosopher and theologian. The Valladolid controversy is of particular importance for the purpose of this project because it makes evidence the two distinct conceptions of the subject just described, that of the true Christian self and man one. So here is Las Casas. And this is Wynter describing Las Casas. And she says, the indigenous peoples of the New World, who were obviously not Christian prior to European settlers' arrival in the New World, could not be thought of as enemies of Christ because they had never heard the word of God and therefore could not have denied it. As a result, within this world order, according to Las Casas, there's no justification through which indigenous peoples could be disenfranchised of their rights and their lands. At the same time, however, Las Casas made the argument that the colonization of Africa was justified because the peoples of Africa were enemies of Christ, enemies because he believed that they had heard the word of God and denied it. As a result, he contended that the African continent belonged to no one prior to European colonization. It was terra nullius, and thus European conquest of the continent was justified. And this is then the start of the transatlantic slave trade. So this is the structure that Las Casas is approaching what it means to be a human being. And so in this instance, it corresponds to the true Christian self described previously. For Sepúlveda, indigenous populations as well as African populations could justifiably be enslaved based on a new conception or order, this time rationality. Furthermore, he believed that to be born a natural slave meant that there was no changing one's social or local position. So as a result, it is here that the modern phenomenon of race as a new extra-humanly determined classificatory principle and mechanism of domination was first invented. Rationality, or the degree to which one is in the mode of being human, becomes constructed through phenotypical and religio-cultural differences. Here, reason, or lack thereof, becomes the justification for slavery and appropriation of lands, but of course, reason here is also inherently racialized. So you may already see where I'm going with this. This brings me to this second move about how it is that this relates to land. So for the Judeo-Christian, our true Christian self, we have, and I'll quote Wynter here, the spirit-flesh code has then been projected onto the physical cosmos, precisely onto the represented non-homogeneity of substance between the spiritual perfection of heavens, as opposed to sublunary realm of the earth, which had to be at the center of the universe as its dregs, end quote. So in other words, what we see is that there's a difference between the heavens and the spirit and the earth and this flesh. In addition, the earth was at the center of the universe insofar as it lacked the capacity for motion, motion being a divine attribute or attribute of heavens or spirits. The general order of existence has implications for the subject that it constituted or that was attempted to be created in its most perfect form, and also structured the conception of the universe. So in addition to the ways in which the cosmos are being mapped according to this true Christian self, the earth was also mapped out and understood according to this existing order of spirit flesh of the true Christian self. During this period, the Christian conception of the world was divided up between realms that were considered to be habitable and were in the grace of God, centering on Jerusalem, and the regions that were considered uninhabitable because they existed outside the grace of God. Therefore, and this is a quote from Winter, before the 15th century voyages of the Portuguese and Columbus, the torrid zone beyond the bulge of Cape Bahadur and the upper coast of Africa had to be known as too hot for habitation, while the Western Hemisphere had to be known as being devoid of land, end quote. The torrid zone comprised those areas of the world that existed outside the grace of God and therefore were uninhabitable. This theocentric conception of what it meant to be human was produced through the master code of spirit flesh and further reified through the non-homogeneity of heavens and earth, as well as the geography of the earth. However, this descriptive statement of what it means to be human was unsustainable for a number of reasons. For instance, and I quote, Winter here, the 15th century voyages prove that the earth was homogeneously habitable by humans, seeing that the torrid zone was indeed inhabited, and that the land of the Western Hemisphere turned out to be above water, end quote. So we see with the true Christian self, the ways in which geography and the cosmos are either determined to be habitable or uninhabitable, specifically for geography. And something also similar happens within Man 1. So here for Winter, she says the rational subject is important because it is bound up with European expansionism and also the colonization of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The implication is therefore that rationality is not in fact universal, but is dependent upon the facing of some from humanity. So there's a shift in the understanding of the cosmos here by supernatural causation to understanding the universe through natural causation, a shift that was required for the rise of the natural sciences. According to Winter, man was still dependent upon a certain conception of God. However, the manner in which God was conceived is strikingly different from the previous era. She writes, and I quote, "It was this new premise that God had created the world, the universe for mankind's sake as a premise that ensured that he would have made it according to rational, non-arbitrary rules that could be knowable by beings that he had made it for, and that would lead to Copernicus' astronomy, that since the universe had been made for our sake by the best and wisest of craftsmen, it had to be knowable," end quote. So here we can also recall the way in which Sepulveda argued for the colonization of the continent of Africa and the New Worlds on the basis of rationality. This brings us to Man 2, and for Winter, Man 2 is the context that we still find ourselves in. So here, mapped onto the current genre of what it means to be human as a biological and economic man, where fitness is determined by economic of financial striving, certain places and spaces are deemed unfit. Economic development is portrayed as one mode for determining degrees of proximity to this economic fitness. Development can be placed here upon a nation, it has been placed upon nation states, larger geographic regions, and smaller areas within cities as well. Perhaps most notably within the US, for instance, prisons and jails, the inner city, and come to denote spaces that have not reached their economic potential until, of course, gentrification moves in. So as a result, what we see is that Winter makes evident how the conception of what it means to be human at various points in time is premised upon the exclusion of groups of people inherently, and it is also done for the purpose of domination of peoples and places. And so she ties throughout this connection between peoples and places. In fact, it seems to be the case that for Winter, the demarcation of space and place as undesirable mirrors the characterization of peoples who occupy those spaces. It is for this reason that Winter focuses so much on the genre of being human that have operated at various points of history, because for her, the two are inextricably bound. So this brings me to thinking about contemporary discussions of environmental racism. And specifically here, I want to draw on Charles Mills' essay titled Black Trash, which was published in 2001. So Winter's overall project is consistent with theorists who explicitly work in the field of environmental racism. For instance, Charles Mills offers corresponding arguments. So in this first quote, what we note is the ways in which space is constructed discursively, and according to the systems of hierarchy, which in this instance is racism. In the second quote, what we see is that Mills notes that within these discursively and racistly organized spaces, that the characterizations of people are often collapsed with the spaces that they inhabit. Furthermore, I would argue that Mill's discussion of value in this quote mirrors Winter's articulation of Man too that I previously discussed, wherein peoples and places are determined according to the presumed economic value that they contribute to the whole. As such, for both Winter and Mills, if collective peoples are devalued, then the places they inhabit will also be devalued. Mill's example of such processes of devaluation comes from the creation of landfill sites, for instance, or other processing plants that can, and invariably more often than not, do lead to toxic living conditions and environmental degradation. Finally, in this third quote, Mills makes evident that these characterizations of devaluation placed upon spaces and peoples are often orchestrated as naturally appearing and therefore unchangeable. This process mirrors, for instance, Winter's discussion of natural slaves in Man 1 and the biological foundation in Man 2. So as a quick recap, what we see here is that bodies and spaces are organized according to certain conceptions of what it means to be human for Winter, that such organization is often overdetermined or characterized as natural, and therefore a new organization of bodies and place requires a new conception of what it means to be human. And just in the couple minutes that I have left, this is really why I find that Winter's project is so fruitful for thinking through environmental racism. Developing a new conception for what it means to be human for Winter results in completely new discursive mappings of spaces and places. So the question then becomes for Winter, what then is this new conception of what it means to be human look like, and how can it address colonialism, anti-Black racism, and other forms of oppression? And so just briefly, this is a twofold approach that she has. The first is that we have to recognize the ways in which the current contexts are organized and the hierarchies that they reinforce constantly. And so for her, it's recognizing the biocentric and economic organization of Man 2 that we find ourselves in. And so here in another essay, she talks about the ways in which the presumption is that we are first biological beings, and then we create culture, but she wants to change that orientation in a certain way. And so in her development of what it means to be human, she draws on a number of theorists. For instance, Aimé Césaire's discussion of science of the word. And here for Aimé Césaire, for Winter, the interest is in thinking about the relationship between science and literature and how it is that literature always imposes upon science. She also turns to Frantz Fanon's sociogeny and thinking about the sociogenic principle, which she calls it, about the relationship between society and conceptions of self and how it's imposed upon by social structures. Then also thinking through W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness for ways of getting outside of dominant frameworks. And so ultimately, she describes this new conception of the human is a homo narrans. And so Alexis Pauline Gumbs in her 2020 book called Dub says it really nicely. She says, Winter says that we are not homo sapiens, we are homo narrans, not the ones who know, but the ones who tell ourselves that we know. She says we therefore have the capacity to know differently. We are word made flesh, but we make words, so we can make ourselves anew. And so in this making ourselves anew with this homo narrans, which is ultimately a bringing together of culture and nature, Paget Henry notes that this is part of thinking about ceremonies, and so ceremonies becomes a really important concept for Winter. And so in creating new epistemes or ways of knowledge. And so ultimately, the point that I want to get to is that Winter's emphasis on ceremony, of these new ways of thinking about how to be human, I think actually will fit quite nicely with critical indigenous theories in relation to ceremonies, place, and also futurity. So thank you.
So we take off.
Yes.
Excellent. Welcome back, everyone. This move from these different paradigms of what it means to be human, the true Christian self, the rational political subject of the state, Man 1, biological and economic man, Man 2. Really, I look forward to your next presentation because this has application to gentrification, as you yourself mentioned, environmental racism, the use of herd immunity for the pandemic, so many empirical applications. But now let's open the floor. We've had excellent presentations and see if there's any questions, comments. We can unmute you. Feel free. let's see, we have a new message here. Oh, so, okay. If environmental racism is woven into all systems of Western culture and society, including language, then how does one attack and defeat the hydra of environmental racism? This is a question for all the panelists, and who would like to address this?
Perhaps I would like to say something.
Go right ahead.
Okay, but I need to share the screen again, just to say something a little bit related with this. Just take me a second. Okay. When I talk about subject and object in this scheme, I can move into the races, because I can say that this is white and this is black. Okay, and even I can write, excuse me, with this, male and female, and all this stuff, all the topics we can put in it, in this little box that I call objectivity. This passivity, with this passivity, is related with dependency. This is the way I think we can't talk about this, because there is more with this. If we talk about center, excuse me, it's on the top of the screen, center, periphery, and there's always a dependency relationship between them. And this center and periphery was made at the very beginning of the conquest of the Americas, because the center was Europe, especially Spain and Portugal, and the periphery are Latin, and now the Americas, the entire continent. And that's all.
Okay, thank you. Let's
wait. Okay.
Okay, another response, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I appreciate the question, and I think that's a part of the difficult question. But I think that also for Sylvia Wynter, what we see is that the tools are already available in a variety of spaces. It's a matter of shifting attention in order to see them. And so Catherine McKittrick's book, Demonic Grounds, uses Wynter's theory to think about how it is that spaces are mapped out, and how it is that we can think of them being mapped out differently. So in a certain sense, she's saying, so Montreal, when Montreal in Canada, had legal slavery, in a certain sense, like one can say, well, it was mapped out according to settler rules, or one can think about the ways in which Black women in those instances organize that space differently. And so it's a matter of this sort of paradigm shift in a certain sense of how it is that we understand how certain spaces are mapped out, and not reinforcing the narrative consistently of the dominant narrative, but recognizing that there's always already alternative narratives that exist alongside, under, and through dominant narratives simultaneously. So it's not as though there's only one language, there's multiple languages. It's a matter of just shifting those paradoxes. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sam Badger would like to formulate a question to the panel. Sam, are you there?
Yeah, hi. Well, first I have a question for Eric. Sorry if I missed it because you talked about it. If you talked about it, but what you were saying, at least the popular mythology that I got as an American person that's in America, of the Bolivian Cochabamba uprising, that's like the instigator of the next like decade and a half, I guess, of Bolivian politics. That like water is an essential thing there, and I guess if you think that speaks then to how this like issue is a base level issue that is like a ground level thing where if you hit rock bottom, this is going to motivate a response from people. You know, I don't know if you know much about that particular chain of events too, but
yeah, no, I'm not really familiar with that. But well, I'll say I was wondering how to approach the water scarcity, for example, that is happening in the Caribbean through philosophy. So I started looking to philosophy related to life. And so when you search like water in philosophy, there is like Tales of Miletus. So I was wondering how can we use nature as an inspiration to solve our philosophical problems. So I was reading his thesis on water, and it was pretty odd because there is not like a explanation, like clear explanation of why the earth is above water, and water is the like there's like gaps that I can't fill with I don't know, my interpretation, because it's a open hypothesis, we can say that. So I wanted to know more about the history or the background of Miletus. So I started reading about where he was raised, and really it struck me that the water was really important, because in the Egypt region, so there are like cultures of river, and I was thinking maybe he used that as an inspiration, but then some other philosopher says no. It doesn't matter if it was the water. It can be used another natural element to explain his theory. But I want to focus, maybe not. Maybe the importance of water and life in his experience impacted him in such a way that he wanted to continue a hypothesis using water and explaining the creation of the universe. So I really go for using nature as an inspiration, and knowing that nature and life are related. So I unite that with the philosophy of liberation and helping the more in need. So yeah, I think that we can use different literature to associate the life, and how can we approach the environmental pollution and everything. So thank you very much.
thank you, Eric. Yeah, I'm not familiar with this philosopher, by the way. What did you say his name is?
Enrique Dussel, or
the Spanish one?
The Spanish one?
Yeah.
Jose Solano.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I can't think of how to formulate my other question, so if someone else wants to ask something, I can mute myself. And thank you.
Fred, yo quisiera hacer una pregunta, si es posible, por favor.
Adelante. Go ahead, Luis Lopez. And then we're going to come back to Carolina Sanchez after you. Go ahead.
Yo quisiera hacer una pregunta especialmente a Enrique, pero quizás para todos, ¿no? La costumbre griega es haber planteado que nosotros somos el sujeto y las cosas, los entes, son objetos. Entonces se establece la relación sujeto-objeto. Pero ahora, cuando se trata de plantear el problema de la naturaleza, ¿cómo crees tú, Enrique, que podemos tratar a la naturaleza? ¿Como un objeto? ¿Como un sujeto? Entonces, en este momento de la crisis, también aparece la naturaleza como si fuera una persona, ¿no? se habla de que está viva, de que piensa, de que nos ataca. Lo hemos dinamizado de una manera que aparece como humanizada. Marx, si yo comprendo bien, aunque siempre la respuesta es problematizada en donde escucho, es que Marx dice que ya la relación que nosotros tenemos con la naturaleza está en nuestro cuerpo. Y esa es la relación más directa que tenemos con la naturaleza. Porque nosotros somos naturaleza, pero ya una naturaleza culturizada, una naturaleza subjetivizada y también que objetiviza, ¿no? Y entonces, ¿cómo plantear ahora esta dinámica con la naturaleza?
Sí. ¿Contesto yo primero? Sí.
Sí, me dirigía primero a ti porque tú has hablado de
Ok. Sí,
específicamente.
bueno, planteas algo que es desde luego un problema muy grande, ¿no? En ese sentido, tienes mucha razón al puntualizar y sobre todo ahora con la pandemia ha surgido mucho esta especie como de nos merecemos esto porque hicimos mal con la naturaleza, ¿no? Y entonces, de alguna manera, la naturaleza toma revancha de nosotros, ¿no? Y entonces hay esta especie de acción-reacción con la naturaleza. Y se humaniza, hasta cierto punto se humaniza como si pensara deliberadamente o intencionalmente que quería hacernos este daño, ¿no? Y es una especie de humanización muy rara, ¿no? Muy antropologizada, ¿no? En eso tienes mucha razón. Ahora, sí, lo que yo propongo, sí hay que tener mucho cuidado con los detalles técnicos, porque esa pregunta ha surgido en varias paneles donde he estado, y desde luego una cosa es el ser humano y otra cosa son los otros vivientes no humanos, ¿sí? No puedo tener la misma relación con un perro, aunque quiera mucho a un perro, o con un árbol, aunque quiera mucho el árbol, que con un ser humano. No lo puedo hacer, ¿no? No es lo mismo. No es que haya jerarquías, no es una cuestión de jerarquías, porque esto es también todo un problema, ¿no? Pensar que el ser humano está hasta la cabeza de una relación vertical, ¿no? Con lo cual se suele hablar del antropocentrismo. No es un antropocentrismo entendido como una relación jerárquica, sino más bien es un antropocentrismo inevitablemente porque nosotros estamos argumentando desde nuestra propia humanidad, no estamos argumentando como árboles, ¿no? O como lombrices. O sea,
Eric, I'm just going to briefly,
okay.
30 seconds in English, that Enrique is arguing that some people are humanizing
Okay.
nature because referring to the pandemia as some kind of evil coming from nature, as if it were anthropocized, in other words, like a person. And Enrique is not placing the human being at the top of any hierarchy, just pointing out that there are differences among living creatures and cautioning about this tendency to humanize the pandemic, as if the pandemic itself were somehow anthropocentric.
Ok, solo para terminar, es muy complejo esto, pero yo no estaría de acuerdo en que la naturaleza tenga derechos, por ejemplo, que es todo un tema, ¿no? Se habla de derechos de la naturaleza, justicia ambiental, etc. Todo eso son temas de liberalismo. Quiero ser muy preciso con esto. La narrativa que estamos construyendo no es liberal, por eso no la aceptamos. Desde luego, si tengo que utilizar un instrumento institucional, tendría que estar en el marco de los derechos humanos y toda esta cuestión. Pero eso no quiere decir que sea una narrativa válida para esta otra narrativa que estamos construyendo, ¿sí? Es muy polémico esto, se entiende creo que poco, pero sí hay que tener claridad de que no es el lenguaje que usamos nosotros, ¿no? Es un lenguaje un poco más sofisticado, de la proxemia, no es lo mismo que la proximidad con los objetos, la proximidad con los seres humanos, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Pero sí creo que es un buen punto para discutir y estaremos discutiendo en eso, Luis. Muchas gracias.
And so, Enrique, Tejas is also saying we don't want to apply the concept of human rights, taking out this idea of rights of nature. That's a form of liberalism. We have to develop some other manner of talking about defending nature. Am I faithful to your basic meaning? Okay. Thank you very much. We're going to, there are several questions here, and I skipped over Carolina Sanchez. How is the discussion of environmental racism, how does it fit into the Ecozoic time, the period when humans need to be present to the planet as participating members of the comprehensive community? Does anyone want to address this, this comment here? It's a question too. Well, I'm not putting pressure on you.
I can
Go ahead.
try to address it. And I'm losing power, so my camera turned off, so my apologies. So I don't know very much about the Ecozoic time, and so I need to look into it more. But I think ultimately the question would become, well, how is it offering to do this kind of thing? And does it perpetuate the conception of human beings that reinforces a hierarchical structure? So again, like I don't know Ecozoic time. Presumably it almost sounds like it would be doing something different, but I think there are also environmental movements that don't then put into question this hierarchical structure, and also as a basis for racism and genocide repeatedly. So I think that that's something I need to look into more. So thank you for that question.
Okay, and there is a follow-up for you. I'm going to go to one that I think brings several questions together, again by Francisco Gallegos, that if every historical conception of humanity implies a less than fully human other, is there also a counter concept or other when it comes to homo narrans? Does this concept imply a dichotomy or distinction between narrating and non-narrating people?
So that's a great question. So thank you, Francisco. I think that my understanding of Winter is that it doesn't seek to create this binary. And essentially what she's trying to do is she's trying to undo these kind of binary systems and understand the complicatedness of how it is that people are constituted and located. And for her, also, she's thinking about origin stories that determine like how it is that groups of people will organize, how it is they understand the world. And so this narrans is sort of, in a certain sense, a proliferation of origin stories or proliferations of how it is that this understanding of what it means to be human can look, and how it is that space is organized and one's relation to place simultaneously. So my understanding for Winter is that it's not the case. And in her essay, Ethno and Social Poetics, she offers this account of thinking about negritude movement. She describes it as a we that needed no other. And so she, in that instance, she says, this is a we that is not based over against any particular groups of people. So my assumption is that that's true for this homo narrans as well. And I think to your second question about ceremony, if I can just jump into that quickly, I think ceremony is this beautiful concept in Winter that I haven't figured out how to place yet. I do know that it's about a certain kind of praxis, because she thinks about being human as a praxis, and I think ceremony is doing that kind of work. And so that's future discussions. And so thank you again for that question.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And we have a question for Enrique. ¿Por qué la naturaleza no puede tener derechos? Why can't nature have rights?
Sí, es una pregunta muy buena. Mira, yo no niego el cuidado a la naturaleza. Hay que entender esas dos cosas. Lo que se niega o lo que negamos es, en todo caso, la narrativa de los derechos humanos. ¿Por qué? Pues porque es totalmente androcéntrica, es patrimonialista, ¿sí? Es más, primero, los derechos humanos estaban basados exclusivamente en que el hombre y no la mujer, por eso eran derechos del hombre. Droit de l'homme, ¿no? O sea, literalmente lo que surgió de la Revolución Francesa eran derechos de los varones nada más, no de las mujeres. Entonces, en esto está basado toda esta concepción de los derechos desde el punto de vista liberal. Lo que estamos criticando es el liberalismo en el fondo de todo esto. No es tanto la posibilidad de cuidado, de, ¿cómo decirlo?, de una relación más armónica con la naturaleza o con todos los vivientes y no vivientes, ¿no? incluyendo el ejemplo que di del oxígeno, pero también atendiendo aquí a lo que dijo Eric, pues también del agua, ¿no? El agua no es un viviente, sin embargo, es algo absolutamente necesario para la vida. No solo para mi vida como ser humano, sino para la de un árbol. Entonces, que quede claro, es una cuestión que va en contra de una narrativa liberal que se basa justamente en solamente el hombre varón y propietario era el que tuvo derechos hasta hace relativamente poco, aún en Occidente. Ya no digamos en otras culturas, aún en Occidente. De hecho, hace poco se celebró un día en el que, el primer día en el que las mujeres pudieron votar creo que en Estados Unidos o en, no sé.
Sí, pero
So,
puedo preguntar algo, porque el problema con los derechos de la naturaleza es que no precisamente emergen dentro de las epistemias occidentales, sino que pertenecen a esas epistemias, mundos epistémicos o situaciones ontológicas, si las quieres poner así, que han sido ignoradas dentro de la modernidad. Y de hecho, por ejemplo, hay varios casos internacionales, el caso de el río Maori en Nueva Zelanda, que obtuvo derechos, pero no precisamente dentro de la justicia hegemónica, sino que usando las concepciones de justicia de los pueblos indígenas. Entonces, creo que ahí son cosas completamente diferentes y son nichos epistémicos diferentes. Y aquí cuando yo estoy hablando desde Holanda, hubo un caso en Suiza donde los suizos trataron de dar derechos, así, o empezar un caso sobre derechos para proteger la naturaleza y no pudieron hacerlo. ¿Por qué no pueden hacerlo? Porque cuando tú vas a hacer un cambio legislativo, tienes que ir a las fuentes filosóficas. Si tú vas a las fuentes filosóficas europeas, no hay. No hay porque un árbol no puede ir a un tribunal y defenderse, ¿ya? Pero dentro de las epistemologías indígenas, hindúes y otras más, sí se puede. Porque tienes por ejemplo, con los chamanes o con autoridades ancestrales, tienes el deber de representar eso. Y ahí quedo yo.
Ok, para responder rápido, para no ir tan lejos, Bolivia tiene en la Constitución esta cuestión del derecho en términos de la Pachamama. O sea, no es algo extraño si a eso nos referimos, pero ha sido complicado porque también Ecuador ha tenido intentos de esto y han sido experiencias muy complicadas porque a final de cuentas ambos países con naturalezas exuberantes además, con muchos recursos naturales, han tenido que echar para atrás todos estos proyectos debido justamente a que el uso de la legislación, igualmente liberal, es una cuestión meramente vertical de las instituciones hacia el pueblo y entonces se ha revertido todo, ¿no? Entiendo la preocupación, pero aquí nadie está en contra de que puedan tener...
Yo comprendo.
Es una cuestión más bien de que esa narrativa que ha construido, y ciertamente lo dices muy bien, ningún filósofo europeo ha hablado en estos términos, ninguno.
Hay dos, está Santo Tomás de Aquino y hay otro más.
Bueno, Francisco de Asís, si tú quieres, sería el gran ecólogo por excelencia. Claro que hay este cuidado de la naturaleza en muchos textos, pero la modernidad se define con estos primeros, por ejemplo, Francis Bacon, es el primero en pensar en términos de que la naturaleza es explotable, ¿no? Para el hombre, ¿no? Y para el hombre aquí entiendas el hombre blanco europeo, ¿no? El varón blanco europeo, ¿no? Entonces, tenemos problemas ahí, ¿no? Porque cómo fundamentar esto es muy nuevo. Hay que hacerlo por otras vías que no son necesariamente las occidentales, ¿no? En eso estoy
Claro, absolutamente. Solamente un comentario más, y yo he escuchado yo soy también filósofa medioambiental, entonces he escuchado muy atentamente todas sus ponencias muy interesantísimas, y los gráficos y todo eso. Es que lo único que he echado de menos es un poco es cómo va ese cambio, porque todavía estamos hablando de principios binarios, la naturaleza y yo, pero no hablan de yo como parte de. Entonces tal vez ahí habría otro paradigma y otro camino. Solamente eso y muchas gracias. ¿Ah?
Yeah, just want to intervene one moment that this discussion still hinges on whether it's appropriate to deploy the term rights because of its origin in the concept of human, but emphasizing man's rights, that it could be patronizing. But then there's another point of view that rights could be deployed in an entirely different epistemic context or manner. So this is a fascinating debate. I want to leave this session open during the break so that those who want to continue the discussion and panelists who also want to address these issues, if you want to take some time from this break period, that would be fine. It's a really stimulating discussion, and I suspect some of you might want to continue it. But I just want to make sure we recognize and together, let's give a round of applause to our panelists. A virtual one. Okay, so the floor is open and continue the discussion if you like.
How much time do we have?
Well, the break is 15 minutes.
Okay. Elizabeth, I've got a comment for you.
Yes.
A historical comment, because your narrative is very Eurocentric, you know, and I was thinking in the term Renaissance and modernity. I will share again the screen, and I would like to say something about it because it's very interesting. How do you sorry. Oh, okay. When we talk about the Renaissance, we have a very elastic period of time that is not very well defined here and here. So we don't know exactly what it is. And the problem is that we define modernity exactly in this point because the Renaissance eliminates all these events here, especially this one, that I think is the most important, the conquest of the Americas. And we said that this is, or we argue that this is the early modernity, yeah, to approximately 16th century. And then we have other modernities. But this is very important because if we eliminate this date, this event, we eliminate our origin, our cultural origin. At least I'm talking about Americas, no? And other problem that I can see in this is there is a difference between Christianity and the Christendom. It's quite different for us because Christianity is that, and Christians, the followers of this historical person, is they are victims in this period of time, and the Christendom, the victims become killers, and it's absolutely other history from this point of departure. And that's all. Thank you.
Enrique, I'm sorry to interrupt everybody, but actually I have to close the meeting in order to open the second one. So I'll give you a minute for y'all to exchange information if you want, so you can continue this conversation. But yeah, I'm very sorry that I have to close it.
Okay.
So, para los que hablan español, tenemos que cerrar esta sección porque para poder abrir la próxima debemos cerrar esta. Así que les voy a dar un minuto para que puedan intercambiar información si así lo necesitan, pero espero verlo a todos o a la mayoría en el próximo panel.
put my email address in the chat box, Anika, if you want to talk about it more. But I take your point. I mean, Winter doesn't. She has a little bit about Aristotle and the ancients, but it's a very particular moment in time that she's starting from, absolutely, and inherently European, and that's the point she's talking about it.
Okay.
So thank you. Yeah.
No, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Peace, everyone. Thank you. Great session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Buenísimo, Enrique.